Have you ever noticed how some chairs remember things? Not in the way that people do, with dates and details, but in the way wood holds warmth long after you've left it, or how fabric carries the scent of someone who used to sit there every evening at the same time. There's a chair like that, tucked in a quiet cabin on the edge of the woods. Its paint is worn smooth from decades of gentle hands. Its cushion sinks just enough to tell you that someone once sat there often. Someone who read in the hush of afternoon or watched snow fall through the window with a cup of tea in hand. They say the chair is still there, by the window that faces west. And some evenings when the wind is soft and the trees are listening, you might swear you see a shape in the fading light. Not a ghost exactly, just memory, still breathing. Tonight we'll visit that cabin. We'll listen to the rain on the roof, feel the warmth of firelight on old wood, and sit quietly in the old chair by the window. Let's begin. There are some evenings that ask nothing of you, no decisions, no replies, no reminders, only your presence and maybe the soft settling of your breath as the world slips gently into twilight. This was one of those evenings. The sky outside had gone the color of warm ash, not quite gray, not yet blue. As the last birds of the day circled once, then folded their wings and disappeared into the trees. Inside the cabin, all was still, the kind of stillness that grows from years of quiet living, of letting the days rise and fall without rushing them along. The fire in the hearth hadn't yet been lit, but the scent of old cedar logs lingered in the stone fireplace, mixing with the faint trace of beeswax and bread crusts in the memory of pine smoke on wool. Near the front window sat an old wooden chair, not rocking, not waiting, just there, with its smooth arms worn pale from use, its legs uneven from years on uneven floors, and a cushion that had lost its firmness but kept its shape just the same, like a hand that had held too many things and now simply rested. The chair faced west, toward the last of the light. The window beside it had a small crack running from top corner to bottom, not deep enough to let in wind, but just visible enough to catch the sun at certain hours and make a prism on the rug. That light was fading now, melting into soft shadow, and as it did, a quiet figure entered the room. He was not young, but then again, he had never been in a hurry to be anything else. His name was Thomas, though most called him Tom. He moved the way trees move in a gentle breeze, unhurried, full of purpose but without sharpness. His hair was mostly silver now, though streaks of the dark still held on near his temples like the last leaves clinging to a tree in early winter. He wore a sweater the color of river stones and slippers that no longer had soles worth mentioning. Still, they fit him well, more memory than garment. In one hand, he carried a small mug of tea, chamomile, with just a hint of honey, not too hot, not too sweet, balanced, like everything he did. With his free hand, he folded the corner of a soft wool blanket over his arm and made his way toward the chair. Not once did the floor protest. Every board had grown used to his weight, had learned to carry him in silence. They didn't creak, they welcomed. Tom sat down, with the kind of care only people who have lost things understand. He didn't sigh exactly, more like he allowed the chair to do the breathing for him. The cushion sank a little under his weight, and a faint scent of old tobacco rose from the fabric. Not smoke, just the memory of it. He placed the tea on the small side table, round with a chipped rim and a scratch shaped like the letter J, from a time long ago when his grandson had driven a toy truck too fast across it. He never buffed the scratch out. He liked it there. It belonged. For a while, Tom didn't move. He just watched the fading trees outside as dusk gathered them into softer outlines, as if the forest itself was ready to rest. From the cabin's eaves, a single drop of rain fell, then another, then a quiet, steady rhythm. It was not a storm. It was the kind of rain that spoke only in whispers, the kind that blurred the edges of the world and made everything feel a little closer, a little softer. Tom smiled to himself. He had always liked rain best when it arrived at twilight. It reminded him of things, not anything sharp or painful, just a gentle ache of seasons past, of warm soup on cool nights, of holding hands on porches, of letters read by candlelight. He reached for the blanket and pulled it over his knees, tucking it in the same way he once did for the little ones who used to nap by the fire with picture books and stuffed bears named after uncles. He didn't miss those days in a longing way. They had been full, and he had been there for all of it. But in the quiet of evenings like this, those moments would return, not as regrets, but as company. The tea cooled slowly. Outside, the rain continued, drawing soft lines down the window glass, each drop carrying a tiny reflection of the fire that wasn't yet lit, and the chair, old, faithful, and familiar, held him, as it always had. Somewhere in the distance a train passed, not close, just the faint, low hum of its echo threading through the trees like a forgotten song. Tom closed his eyes for a moment, not to sleep, but to listen. There was something comforting in knowing the world kept moving, even when you sat still, that someone out there was going somewhere, while you simply stayed, that both were fine. A log shifted in the fireplace, though no fire had been made. The cabin breathed, the rain fell, and the old chair by the window creaked once, very gently, as if settling into the evening right beside him. Tom stayed in the chair long after the last light had slipped beneath the ridge. Outside, the world had settled into darkness, but it was the kind of darkness that felt safe, like an old coat draped gently over your shoulders. The rain had softened now, becoming a kind of mist that whispered against the window pane. He watched it collect, bead by bead, tracing lazy lines down the glass, some merging with others as if they were old friends crossing paths again. He took a slow sip of tea. It had cooled, but not unpleasantly so. There was something comforting in the way flavors changed with time, how the honey mellowed, how the chamomile grew earthier, almost like the steeped patience of the day itself. Tom wasn't thinking of anything in particular, yet everything seemed to visit him at once. A drawer that stuck in the kitchen, the worn page of a recipe he could nearly recite by heart, the sound of slippers on the floor that weren't his own, the way sunlight used to fall through the window in June, casting golden bars across the floor like a memory trying to stay. He glanced over at the hearth, still empty, still unlit. He didn't need the fire tonight, not because it wasn't cold, but because the warmth of memory filled the room more fully than flame. The candle, though, he'd forgotten to light it. On the sill beside the window, a stubby candle in a clay holder sat waiting. He reached slowly, carefully, not out of frailty, but with the respect one gives to old rituals. He struck a match. Its flare was small, but decisive. In the dim cabin, it was enough. The flame caught, wavered, then steadied into its evening posture. It cast a low, golden light across the chair's arm, glinting against the curve of the tea mug and warming the colors in the old photograph frame that leaned, slightly tilted on the table. It was Ella's candle, really. She had always insisted on lighting one at dusk, not for show, not even for scent or glow, but because she once said, "The house should know we're still here." Tom smiled at the memory. He hadn't thought of that in a while. The way she would strike the match with a kind of reverence, hold her breath as the wick caught, and then exhale as if the whole house had exhaled with her. It had been one of those quiet things they shared, a ritual not spoken of, just done, as natural as brushing crumbs off the table or folding towels in thirds instead of halves, the small things that hold a life together without ever demanding notice. He looked at the flame now and saw more than fire. He saw presence, continuity, the gentle flickering echo of a voice that once read poems aloud from the corner chair while he dried dishes and pretended not to be listening, even though he always was. The room felt full tonight, not crowded, just held. Even the walls seemed to remember. The soft scuffs by the door where boots had leaned, the faded spot on the wallpaper where a birthday banner once hung for a grandchild now grown, the floorboard near the stove that dipped ever so slightly, a gentle sag born from years of daily steps taken with purpose, with habit, with love. Outside a wind stirred, not harsh, not cold, just a sort of breeze that made leaves turn over on their stems and pine needles shimmer in response. It passed over the roof with a hush, brushing against the chimney stones and rattling, just faintly, the edge of the window pane. Tom didn't flinch. The house had always spoken in such ways, groans, sighs, occasional creaks, like a living thing, and he had long since learned its language. He leaned back into the chair, feeling its familiar frame adjust beneath him. It didn't complain, it never had, and he remembered all at once a winter evening long ago. One of those still, snowy nights when the world turned pearl-colored, and the only sound was the ticking of the mantel clock and the low murmur of the radio playing something classical and slow. He had sat here, just like this. Ella was knitting something red, a scarf maybe, or mittens. He couldn't quite recall. What he remembered more clearly was the way she paused in her knitting, looked up from the yarn and said quietly, "Do you think we'll still be sitting here in 50 years?" And he had smiled, because the answer felt too big for words, so he reached for her hand instead. He never had to answer. She already knew. That was decades ago now. The scarf was long gone. The snow from that night had melted into countless spring rains, but the chair remained, and so did he, and somehow that felt like enough. Tom took another sip of tea, its last warmth meeting the back of his throat. He placed the mug down gently. The candle flickered. The rain softened into mist. In the stillness, you could almost hear the quiet hum of time moving, not rushing, but unfolding like a blanket being drawn up to the chin. Soft, deliberate, secure. He closed his eyes, not to sleep, not just yet, but to listen more fully, to feel the room breathing with him, to let the quiet speak. The next morning came quietly. It didn't announce itself with bright sun or noisy bird song. Instead, it unfolded slowly, like fog rolling across the fields, soft and even, as though the light itself wasn't quite ready to rise. Tom stirred in the early stillness, not from any alarm or urgency, but from the natural rhythm that had guided his days for years. He sat up slowly, the blanket falling from his lap in a hush of wool. The cabin greeted him the same way it always did, without fanfare, without change. The clock ticked steadily on the shelf. The stove gave a faint pop as it cooled from its last use, and the light through the curtain was pale, diffused as if the day were waiting to be invited in. Tom shuffled into the kitchen. The kettle was already filled. He had done that the night before, just as he always did. Some things you prepare for without thinking, because they carry you forward before the day can ask anything of you. He set it on the stove and lit the flame, then turned to open the small tin of loose-leaf tea, a blend Ella had once made herself. Dried chamomile from the garden, a touch of lemon balm, and mint clipped from the patch behind the porch. Even now, though the herbs were years gone, he tried to mix the blend the same way, by feel, by memory. He scooped the mixture into the tea ball, lowered it gently into the mug, and waited as the steam began to rise. While the water warmed, he leaned against the counter and looked out through the small window above the sink. The trees outside were dripping gently from the night's rain. Their leaves, heavy and dark, hung motionless in the early gray. Beyond them, the field stretched out like a forgotten quilt. Patches of golden grass, bramble, and the long, soft line of the stone wall that marked the end of his land. A blue jay landed on the porch railing, shook its feathers, and let out a call, sharp but not jarring, as if to say, "I'm still here too." Tom nodded. Sometimes he found comfort in those small confirmations, that the world beyond the cabin still turned, that the birds still came, even when no one called. The kettle whistled softly, and he poured the hot water over the waiting herbs, watching the color bloom in slow spirals through the cup. He carried the mug back to the front room, where the chair still waited. Of course it did. He sat once more, as he had the night before, and many nights before that. The candle had long since burned out, but the faint trace of wax still hung in the air, sweet and warm, like something kind left behind. He held the mug in both hands and let the warmth seep into his fingers. The heat was gentle, not demanding, like a hand placed quietly on your back. There were days when Tom would sit for hours in that chair without a single thought needing to be chased. This morning felt like one of them, the kind of morning where the world didn't insist on anything. No decisions, no answers, just a slow unfolding of whatever the day chose to offer. He took a sip. The tea was stronger than last night's. The mint a little more forward, but still familiar, still enough. His eyes drifted to the small cabinet near the hearth. A squat little thing made of pine, its top worn smooth by decades of elbows and hands. Inside were papers, not important ones, just old letters, recipes, receipts from stores that no longer existed. Ella had kept everything, not out of sentiment exactly, but out of respect for the story each scrap told. Tom hadn't opened that cabinet in a while, not because it was painful, but because there was a comfort in simply knowing it was there. Still, this morning, without quite meaning to, he stood up, crossed the rug, and eased open the creaky door. The scent inside was unmistakable. Paper, dust, lavender, time made tangible. He reached for the top envelope in the pile. The handwriting was hers, looping and firm, ink slightly faded. For when it rains too many days in a row, the note on the front said. He smiled, a soft, involuntary smile that came not from surprise, but from the way she always seemed to know what to say long before the moment arrived. He didn't open it, not yet. Instead, he slipped it into the pocket of his sweater, intending to read it by candlelight that evening. Some things are better left for the hush of night. He closed the cabinet, not with sorrow, but with gratitude, then returned to the chair, the tea, the view of the damp trees beyond the window. The wind had picked up just slightly, shaking loose a few leaves from the sycamore near the porch. They drifted down in spirals, each one a quiet, singular descent, and he watched them fall, not with longing, but with the reverence of someone who had learned that the beauty of a thing is often most visible just before it lets go. The chair creaked again, a small, familiar sound, like the house saying good morning in its own slow language. Tom closed his eyes, the mug still warm in his hands, the day still early, and nothing, absolutely nothing, demanding his attention. The morning wore on without announcement. The clock above the hearth ticked its way toward noon, but Tom didn't glance at it once. Time in this place moved more by feeling than by numbers. It was measured in the shifting of light on the floorboards, the movement of shadows on the table, and the cooling of tea left half drunk on the windowsill. He had dozed for a while, not quite asleep, but not fully in the waking world either. That kind of rest that settles in quietly, like a cat curling itself into a warm patch of sun. When he stirred again, the house felt a little warmer, not from a fire, there wasn't one yet, but from the sense that the day had truly arrived, carrying with it the faintest promise of purpose. He rose from the chair slowly, rolling his shoulders once, feeling the way his body had grown into its own rhythm over the years. The old floor creaked in response, not from strain, but from habit. Tom wandered into the kitchen again, this time drawn not by tea but by something older, a memory that had come back to him when he'd closed his eyes. The bread. He hadn't made it in months, perhaps longer, but as he stood there in the kitchen light, which had now turned from gray to golden, he could see it all as clearly as if it were laid out before him. The mixing bowl, the worn wooden spoon, the small ceramic jar of yeast with a lid that clicked gently into place. He reached without hesitation for the apron that hung by the back door. Ella's apron. It was a simple thing, made of faded blue cotton with one deep pocket at the front and a row of delicate stitching along the hem that only someone who loved quiet detail would have bothered to sew. He slid it over his head and tied it gently behind him, the way he had seen her do hundreds, no, thousands of times. The cloth still held the faintest trace of flower and lavender. It made his chest tighten, just slightly, not from grief, from love, the kind that never needed to raise its voice to be known. He began slowly, measured, each motion deliberate, as if the ingredients needed time to remember too. The flower was kept in an old tin under the counter. He opened it and smiled. A few sprigs of dried rosemary rested on top, tucked there, perhaps years ago, when Ella had last used it for her herb loaf in spring. The smell rose like a whisper, filling the small kitchen with the sudden warmth that no stove could match. He mixed in the yeast and sugar, watching the bubbles bloom on the surface of warm water, like tiny memories waking from sleep. He stirred gently, not rushing the process. There was no need. Bread would rise when it was ready, not before. As he kneaded the dough, he found his hands remembered more than he did. They folded and pressed, turned and lifted the way hers had taught them. He could almost hear her voice again, not instructing, just offering little comments, half to herself, half to the dough. Too sticky, a bit more flour. Don't forget to talk to it. It rises better when you're kind. He smiled at that. Ella had believed the dough could feel things. Warmth, patience, even mood. And maybe she was right. Some loaves rose like joy, others flat as a sigh. He placed the dough in a bowl, covered it with a damp cloth, and set it on the counter near the window, where the sun touched the wood just so. While it rose, he sat again in the old chair, the apron still around his waist, flour on his hands, a small smudge of it on his cheek. He didn't wipe it off. He liked the feeling, as though he were sharing the day with someone, not just reenacting it. The house seemed to breathe more fully now. The air was thicker, warmer, alive. The window let in a faint breeze carrying the smell of damp leaves, and somewhere in the distance a woodpecker worked its steady rhythm against the trunk of an old oak. Life went on in small, undemanding ways, and Tom, in the middle of it, felt no pressure to do anything more than what he was already doing. When the dough had doubled, and it had, slowly but surely, he moved back into the kitchen, shaped it into a soft oval, placed it in the old iron loaf pan that had belonged to his mother before Ella, before even his own hands had learned the rhythm. The oven creaked as it warmed, its heat humming gently through the walls. As the bread baked, the scent filled the cabin. It wasn't just the smell of yeast and flour. It was memory, comfort, childhood mornings and winter evenings, familiar voices in old kitchens, and the quiet pride of pulling something warm and whole from an oven with your own two hands. When it was done, he let it rest. Didn't slice it yet, just admired it there on the rack, steam curling gently from its golden top. The sun had shifted now, casting longer shadows across the floor. Soon it would be time to light the candle again. Soon, but not yet. He carried the loaf into the front room and placed it on the small table beside the chair. Then he sat, the scent of fresh bread wrapping around him like a blanket, his apron still on, his hands still dusted in flour, his heart quiet and full, and the chair, as always, held him. The sun had dipped lower now, casting a soft amber light across the worn floorboards. In the stillness of the room, the scent of freshly baked bread lingered, warm, slightly sweet, and unmistakably home. Tom had not moved much since he placed a loaf on the table. He simply sat with it, as if sharing the silence with something that had known him a long while. The candle had not yet been lit for the evening, but he could already feel the day beginning to lean into twilight. Shadows had grown longer, stretching from the base of the cupboard to the edge of the rug, slow dancers moving with the hush of time. He rested his hand on the arm of the chair, its curve smooth and cool beneath his palm. That simple gesture, the feel of wood softened by years of touch, pulled forward a memory, not sharp or sudden, but rising slowly like mist off a late summer field. It had been a late September day, many years ago, the kind of day when the wind turns just enough to rustle the edge of things. The corn stalks, the tall grasses, the edge of your shirt collar, letting you know autumn has begun its quiet entrance. Tom had been younger then, much younger, but not so young that he didn't know how rare a still day like that could be. He and Ella had walked out into the field behind the house. It had just been mowed the week before, the cut hay gathered in wide windrows, not yet baled, but golden and fragrant in the afternoon sun. The air was rich with the scent of warm earth and drying grass. Crickets sang in the shadows, and somewhere far off, a tractor rattled down the old gravel road. They hadn't said much that day. They rarely needed to. Instead, they walked slowly, his arm occasionally brushing hers, their feet finding the same rhythm across the uneven ground. At one point, they had paused by the sycamore at the far edge of the field, the same tree that still stood today, its white trunk mottled like peeled paint, its wide leaves catching every shade of light the sky had to offer. Ella had bent to pick something from the ground, a sprig of clover, 3 leaves, one tipped in red. She had twirled it between her fingers, smiled at it, and then tucked it behind his ear with a chuckle that was softer than wind through grass. "For luck," she had said, "and because you look too serious." He had laughed, though not loudly, just enough to join her moment, just enough to carry the warmth between them. Then they sat, right there at the edge of the field, backs against the tree, watching the clouds move like drifting sheep above the golden land. The world had felt enormous that day, not in the way that overwhelms, but in the way that invites you to rest within it. No obligations, no looming tasks, only sky and field and the quiet knowledge that this too was part of living. Ella had spoken then, after a long stretch of shared silence. "I hope we grow old gently," she said. He hadn't answered, but he remembered looking at her profile, the soft curve of her cheek, the way a loose strand of hair danced in the breeze, and thinking, "You already are." That memory came to him now, in the dimming light of the cabin, with the fresh loaf cooling by his side and the smell of rain still clinging to the window panes. He could almost feel the warmth of the sun from that September day, even though the air here now carried the weight of approaching evening. Funny, he thought, how memories didn't demand your attention. They came when they pleased on their own time, unfolding gently as if to remind you that the past still cared enough to visit. Tom reached for the candle, his hand steady, his movement slow. The match flared softly in the quiet. The wick caught quickly as though it had been waiting, and once again the golden glow spread across the small room, warming the wood, the walls, the face of the loaf resting in peace on the plate. He leaned back into the chair. The old cushions sighed beneath his weight, a good familiar sigh. And outside, the leaves of the sycamore shivered just once before settling back into stillness. Night had not fully come yet, but it was on its way, and Tom, with his memories in his bread in his chair by the window, was ready to welcome it. The candle flickered as the wind moved outside, not strong, not angry, but thoughtful, a wind that had wandered far, gathering the scent of pine and cold stream water before slipping down the chimney stones to remind the cabin that the world was shifting seasons once more. Tom sat quietly, his hands resting on the worn arms of the old chair, his eyes watching the flame dance behind its glass. Evening had fully arrived now. The sky had turned to ink, and the trees stood still, barely outlines in the distance beyond the window. The bread had cooled. He'd sliced a small piece earlier, spread a bit of butter across the warm crumb, and eaten it slowly, as if eating something sacred. He wasn't hungry anymore, but the act had been comforting, like greeting an old friend and hearing them say, "You still remember." And now, as the warmth of the candle deepened the shadows in the corners of the room, another memory had begun to stir, not loud, but steady, like a steady knock at the door of the mind, familiar and kind. It was the first night they had ever spent in the cabin. He could still recall it, though it had happened decades ago. It had been cold, a kind of cold that wrapped itself into your collar and slipped into the cuffs of your sleeves. Late November, maybe, or early December. The fields had already browned, and frost clung to the edges of the porch rail. The sycamore had dropped all its leaves, standing like a pale sentinel outside the kitchen window. They hadn't planned on moving in that week, not yet, not with so much left undone. The chimney needed cleaning. The pantry shelves still sat bare. The water in the pipes had a mind of its own, but Ella had looked at him that morning, her eyes shining despite the chill, and said with a grin, "It feels like time." He didn't argue. He never did when she smiled like that. So they came, with boxes half packed and blankets that smelled like cedar chests, and a small crate of apples she insisted on bringing even though the kitchen had no oven yet. They had lit a fire that first night. Tom crouched carefully beside the hearth, coaxing the flame to catch, while Ella unrolled their old rug in front of the fireplace, smoothing the corners with her palms as though she were blessing the room. There had been no furniture then, not yet, just that rug and 2 wool coats laid on the floor, and a thermos of soup he'd made the day before. The soup wasn't good, too much thyme, and the potatoes hadn't softened properly, but she ate it anyway, sipping from the lid of the thermos and smiling as if it had been served in a fine bowl. "Home," she had whispered, her breath making small clouds in the air. "We're here now." They slept on that rug that night, shoulder to shoulder, with their coats pulled over them and an extra blanket folded from the truck. The fire burned down to embers, casting soft orange across the ceiling beams and the old wooden floor that creaked. By morning, the snow had stopped. It hadn't fallen hard, just a gentle dusting, the kind that hushes the world without insisting on staying. The ground outside the cabin wore it like a fine veil, thin enough for the golden heads of last year's grass to peek through, but thick enough to muffle every sound into a soft breath of white. Tom stood at the window, his hands wrapped around a cup of tea still steaming. He didn't shiver. There was a kind of warmth that came not from fire, but from memory. The snow brought one back now, clear as a photograph, though gentler, fuzzed at the edges with time. It was early spring, years ago. The snow had melted weeks earlier that year, and the thaw left behind a softness in the ground that made even footsteps feel like kindness. The garden patch had waited all winter, a humble square behind the cabin, bordered by worn fieldstone and a crooked gate that never fully latched. Ella had risen early that morning, as she always did when the sun hinted at warmer days. He remembered the sound of her boots on the porch, the creak of the screen door, the rustle of her coat as she stepped into the chill with a basket under one arm and a trowel in her hand. He'd followed a moment later carrying 2 mugs, hers with the tiny bluebirds painted along the rim. The earth had still been damp, dark, and fragrant. Worms turned in the furrows left behind by the frost, and robins had already begun hopping among the leaves, curious and hopeful. She had crouched at the edge of the garden, knees in the dirt, her sleeves rolled to the elbow. A smudge of soil streaked across her cheek. Tom had sat on the overturned crate nearby, watching as her fingers worked through the soil. Not quickly, not urgently, but with reverence. She treated seeds like promises, small things worth believing in. She didn't just plant them, she spoke to them. "You'll need patience, little one," she had whispered, half to the seed, half to herself. "But that's something we have plenty of." And she was right. They did. That spring they grew mostly things that fed them. Lettuce, carrots, a few potatoes, and 2 stubborn rows of tomatoes that refused to flourish until late July. But tucked into one corner, just beyond the reach of the morning shadow, she planted a row of zinnias. She hadn't planned to. She'd bought the seeds on a whim, or drawn in by the picture on the packet, a burst of pinks and oranges that looked too bright to be real. When he asked her why zinnias, She'd only smiled and said, "The kitchen window could use some color." And so they grew, small at first, almost bashful. Then, come August, a riot of color in the morning sun. Cheerful, unapologetic, and taller than she'd expected. She cut one every day and placed it in a glass jar by the sink, sometimes two, and when they began to fade, she dried a few in a basket on the windowsill, saying they reminded her that even brightness had its seasons. Tom remembered those mornings in the garden as some of their quietest, and somehow also the fullest. There had been no rush to speak, no need to explain, just the rhythm of her hands in the soil, the calls of birds in the trees, the soft scrape of the trowel, and the creak of his chair as he sipped tea and watched the world come alive again. Sometimes a squirrel would dart across the fence, startling the cat that lay curled near the steps. Sometimes the wind would carry the scent of lilacs from the neighbor's bush 2 fields over, but mostly it had been peace. That spring had passed like all seasons do, slowly, then all at once. The garden bloomed, the kitchen filled with the smell of herbs drying on strings. The evenings grew longer, and the porch swing earned its place again as the sun lingered past supper. But those first few mornings, with the thaw still fresh in the ground, and her voice humming to seedlings no taller than a thumb, those stayed. More than the tomatoes, more than the carrots, the zinnias stayed too, in memory if not in vase, bright as ever, forever in bloom on the windowsill of a quiet spring long past. Back in the present, Tom stepped away from the window. The snow was already beginning to retreat under the sun's pale gaze. A few birds stirred in the trees. He set the mug down, took a deep breath, and walked toward the back door. He opened it slowly, letting the cool air drift in, and there, at the edge of the porch, the garden waited, just as it always had, still bare, still brown, but not empty. Never empty. That afternoon passed the way quiet afternoons do, without urgency, without direction, just a slow leaning of light across the rug, the shifting of the breeze through the trees, and the occasional creak from the old beams above, as if the house was stretching gently in its frame. Tom had spent much of the day in stillness. He'd moved from chair to kitchen, from window to porch, but never in a hurry. Everything around him had its rhythm, and he had long ago learned to follow it rather than fight it. By late afternoon, the clouds had gathered into soft herds above the ridgeline. Not stormy, just thick enough to blur the edges of the sunlight. He stood now in the hallway, his hand resting on the frame of the door that led into the small room off the kitchen, what they had once called the writing room, though it had never held a computer, and the only thing electric inside was a lamp with a cord frayed near the base and a switch that clicked like the shutter of an old camera. The door creaked as he opened it. Of course it did, it always had. Inside, the air felt slightly cooler, touched with the scent of old paper and linseed oil. Dust motes floated lazily in the slanted light from the narrow window, and the small writing desk sat just where it always had, beneath the shelves of books, between the 2 tall-backed chairs they could never gotten around to reupholstering. Tom stepped in slowly. His feet made no sound on the worn wooden floor. He wasn't sure what brought him in today. He didn't come here often anymore. But something in the hush of the house, in the angle of light through the window, in the way the day had moved without saying much, something had nudged him. He sat down at the desk. It was a simple piece with 3 small drawers in a surface marred by coffee rings and ink stains and the scratch marks left by a pen nib that had once pressed a little too hard during a heated letter to the phone company. Ella had used this desk more than he had. She liked to write things down. Grocery lists, recipes, notes in the margins of library books. But mostly, she wrote letters, not emails, never emails. She liked the slowness of pen and paper, the thought it required, the pauses, the space between words that allowed the heart to catch up with the hand. Tom ran his fingers along the edge of the desk, then reached toward the top drawer. It stuck a little. It always had. He jiggled it gently and it slid open, releasing a faint scent of cedar and old envelopes. Inside were loose papers, some folded, some yellowing at the corners. A dried flower pressed inside a torn notebook, a spool of blue thread, and beneath them, a bundle of small note cards tied together with a ribbon that had once been red, now the color of old wine. He picked it up slowly as if afraid it might crumble, but it held. He untied the ribbon. The knot came loose easily, as if it had been waiting to be opened. The cards were all in Ella's handwriting. He knew it instantly. The first one simply said, "For rainy afternoons and restless hearts." He smiled. She had always left little things like this. Notes tucked into books, recipes with "Don't forget the smile" written at the bottom, scraps of paper slipped into his coat pocket when he wasn't looking. He turned to the next card. "Do you remember the evening we picked blackberries and you insisted on eating more than we saved?" He laughed, aloud this time. A soft sound like the clearing of a throat that had nothing to clear. They had gone blackberry picking near the edge of the field one late August, hands stained purple by the end. He had eaten more than his share. She had swatted his hand playfully and told him he was impossible. It had been a very good day. The third card read, "I hope this drawer is open when the light is soft." He looked up. It was. The clouds outside had shifted again, and the window now glowed with that honeyed color that comes just before evening, when everything feels suspended, as if the world has paused for a breath. He turned through a few more cards. Some were funny, some tender, some just a sentence or two, a thought she must have had while folding laundry or shelling peas. But every one of them felt like her voice, resting gently on his shoulder. They weren't love letters in the grand sense. They were quiet things, domestic, precise. "Don't forget to watch the finches at the feeder. They always come before rain. There's more joy in mending than buying new. The bread will rise when it's ready. So will you." Tom sat back in the chair, the bundle resting in his lap. He didn't feel sad, not quite. It was more like being visited by a kindness you didn't realize you still carried. Something you thought had left, but had only stepped into the next room for a while. He placed the cards back in order, tied the ribbon again, though not quite as tight, and returned them to the drawer. He left it slightly open this time, just enough for light to reach inside. Then he stood, his knees stiff but steady, and walked to the window. Outside, the wind had quieted. The trees stood still, and from somewhere in the distance a mourning dove called, low and soft, like a lullaby written in the shape of evening. The next morning arrived with a sky the color of cream, soft and overcast, not gloomy, but quiet, the kind of sky that made the world seem closer, as if the hills had stepped in just a little, whispering something only the trees could understand. Tom rose before the kettle whistled. His body, even in its slower years, seemed to know the light, how it changed when spring crept closer to summer, how the birds adjusted their calls just slightly, and how the wind smelled different once the earth had fully woken from its winter sleep. He didn't speak as he moved through the cabin. He rarely did in the early hours. There was a kind of reverence and silence before breakfast, a respect for the newness of a day that hadn't yet asked anything of him. The chair by the window sat empty, but waiting. The candle stub had burned low the night before, and now its wax clung to the dish like melted memory. He didn't replace it yet. That would come later. For now, he moved toward the back door, his mug in hand, and stepped out onto the porch. The air was cool, but not cold. It carried the scent of damp soil and lilac, and something else, barely there. Maybe clover, maybe the soft perfume of the tiny yellow flowers that crept each spring through the cracks in the stone steps. Tom stood for a moment, barefoot on the old wood, feeling the grain beneath his soles. Each board familiar, each squeak and give, known to him like the voice of a longtime friend. He looked out across the clearing. The grass had grown taller in the last few weeks, not wildly, but enough that it bent under the weight of dew and shimmered silver in the morning light. And along the edge of the fence near the place where Ella had once kept a row of clay pots stacked like teacups for the garden, the wildflowers had returned. They came every year, but he never knew exactly when they would appear. One day the earth was just green and plain, and the next, color. Soft purples, pale whites, a few stubborn reds, not in neat rows, not with any planning, just there, like a kind gesture with no reason behind it except for beauty itself. He walked down the steps slowly, the mug warming his fingers. When he reached the patch, he crouched, his knees reminding him of the years, but not arguing. He reached out and touched one of the blossoms, a blue one small as the pad of his thumb. Its petals trembled slightly in the breeze but didn't let go. Ella had loved these flowers. She never called them weeds, even though the seed catalogs didn't bother naming them. Anything that comes back without asking, she'd said once, ought to be welcomed. She'd cut a few sometimes, just enough to place in a tiny vase on the table by the salt and pepper shakers. Never too many. She said the rest belonged to the bees. Tom stayed there for a while, kneeling among the flowers, listening to the bees hum, watching the sun edge its way through the morning clouds as if it, too, was learning how to begin again. Eventually he stood, stretching carefully, and turned back toward the porch. Before stepping up, he paused and bent to pick one flower, just one. A white one with a little yellow at its center, its stem curved slightly as if it had grown in the shape of a bow. He brought it inside and placed it in a small glass near the sink. There was no water in it yet, but he liked how it looked there, alone but upright. He stood there, hand resting on the counter, the flower leaning toward the window. It looked right, like it had always been part of the room, just waiting to arrive. Later that day, he would sit in the chair again. He would light a new candle. He would slice the last of the bread and make a sandwich with soft cheese and apple. But for now, he stood in the quiet kitchen with the scent of lilac and wildflower in the air, his tea cooling slightly, and the warm hush of a home that had never asked for more than his presence. The afternoon settled itself gently into the day, like a book finding its way back to the shelf without being told where it belonged. There was no sound of trucks on the gravel road, no barking from the neighbor's dog across the hollow. Even the birds seemed to have taken a kind of reverent pause, perched among the branches with heads tilted as if listening for something softer than their own songs. Inside the cabin, Tom moved slowly about the kitchen. He wasn't in search of anything, not really. He just found himself standing at the old wooden counter, one hand resting on the drawer handle, the other wrapped around a small teacup, warm and fragrant with ginger and honey. The light had changed again, not gone, but golden now, slanting across the shelves and casting long shadows from the kettle and the row of spice jars that lined the back ledge like quiet, attentive guests. He'd just finished tidying up, not in any grand sense, just wiping a few crumbs from the table, rinsing a plate, tucking a dish towel over the arm of the stove. It wasn't a routine he thought much about. It was just something he did, as naturally as breathing, as silently as remembering. It reminded him of the afternoons when Ella used to hum while folding napkins. Always the same tune. He never knew the name of it. He still didn't. But when he passed the linen drawer, he could almost hear it. There was a kind of comfort in that. How memory didn't always require full attention to be felt. Sometimes it just curled up beside you, small and steady, asking nothing. Tom poured the rest of his tea into a clean mug and carried it toward the porch. The door was already unlatched. He rarely locked it anymore. There wasn't anyone nearby to keep out, and the wind had never asked for permission. He stepped onto the porch with the same care he'd used for years, not because the boards were weak, but because there was something respectful in meeting the day without hurry. The screen door clicked behind him with that same soft thud it always had, like a dog settling into a nap on the floor. He sat in the wicker chair by the far corner, where the sun still reached, but not too harshly. It was a chair he'd mended more times than he could count, reweaving bits of it with twine and patience, never quite matching the original braid, but good enough to hold him. The porch looked out toward the field, now dappled in early summer light. The grass swayed gently in the breeze, and the fence posts leaned in their usual angles, weathered but holding. To the right, the garden still bore the shape of last month's labor, rows of green now rising with intent, small tomato plants pushing up beside stakes, beans curling their way upward, and marigolds standing guard in the corners, as Ella had once taught him. They keep the bugs off and make the garden smile. That's what she'd said, and he'd believed her. As he sipped his tea, he let his mind drift. Not far, just enough to catch the edges of a memory that had begun to stir. It was of a visit, not a grand one. Just a Tuesday afternoon, years ago, when their friend Ruth had come by. She'd arrived without warning, as she often did, carrying a bag of apples and her sharp-witted observations about the state of the world. Tom remembered her laughter, clear and slightly mischievous, and the way she leaned back in the porch chair with one leg crossed over the other, always wearing socks that didn't match. She and Ella had sat together at the small table, peeling apples, talking about things that mattered and didn't. The weather, the cost of flour, the novel Ruth was pretending to write. He'd brought them tea then, just as he held it now, and listened from his place on the steps, not joining the conversation, just being part of it the way trees are part of a story without needing to speak. That day had lasted longer than it should have, or maybe it hadn't. Maybe it had only lasted exactly as long as it needed to. By the time Ruth left, the sun had dipped, the apples were cored and sliced, and a pie had been assembled on the kitchen counter, with flour still dusting Ella's sleeves. Tom remembered her standing there, smiling at the imperfect crust, her hands streaked with butter and cinnamon. "It's not pretty," she'd said, "but it's made of real things. That counts for something." He smiled at that now, lifting the tea to his lips again. the warmth of it anchoring him in both past and present. The porch creaked gently beneath him. A breeze carried the faint scent of mint from the patch near the steps. Somewhere nearby, a screen door slammed from another house he couldn't quite see. It was good to know other lives were moving too. He finished his tea slowly, not because he needed more time, but because there was no reason to rush to less. Then he set the mug on the wide railing, leaned back and listened to the birds, to the breeze, to the echo of a laugh that had long since faded but still lived somewhere between the slats of the porch floor and the curve of a teacup. The sun lowered itself behind the trees. The light stretched, then let go. And Tom, with his empty mug and quiet breath, closed his eyes and let the rest of the day become part of the stillness. Evening had begun its quiet descent, not suddenly, just a slow, familiar slipping of day into night, a soft dimming of the corners, a cooling in the air that made the porch boards feel different underfoot. Even the sounds outside changed, like the world had turned a page and entered a new chapter of stillness. Tom had come back in from the porch a little earlier than usual. The tea had been good, the light gentle, but the breeze carried something brisk in it now. A whisper of coming cold, perhaps the first true note of autumn tucked into summer's sleeve. Inside the cabin, the air was warm. The walls, steeped in sun from the afternoon, held on to that heat like an old dog lying across your boots, comfortable, familiar, unmoving. But Tom found himself walking toward the hallway without fully knowing why. His slippers brushed softly along the wooden floor. The light above the door flickered once before holding steady. At the end of the hall, beneath the old framed print of the sycamore in winter, stood the narrow door to the cedar-lined closet. It hadn't been opened in months. The closet wasn't large, barely wide enough for a man to stand inside, but it had always been enough. They had kept their winter coats in there, some scarves, a pair of tall boots that Ella used to wear when the snow piled high across the path to the woodshed. Tom opened the door slowly, and the scent of cedar rose immediately, rich, earthy, dry. It wrapped around him like an old melody that hadn't been sung in a long time but still knew the tune. The light inside was dim, but his eyes adjusted easily. He reached for the coat. Her coat. It was still there, hanging on the far side, its shoulders a little sagged, the wool slightly faded along the collar. It was a deep forest green, almost black in the right light. She had picked it out herself from the second-hand shop in town. It had a small tear on the left sleeve, patched with navy thread that didn't quite match. "I like that it's already lived a little," she'd said, running her hand along the seam. "Makes it feel less like a purchase, more like a rescue." Tom ran his fingers gently over the wool. He didn't take it off the hanger, not yet. Instead, he let his hand rest where her hand once had, at the pocket, worn soft at the corners from years of holding gloves, handwritten lists, sometimes nothing at all. That pocket had once held a stone, smooth, palm-size, found by the river bend on a walk they'd taken the year the garden failed. She'd kept it, not because it was rare, but because it was round, solid, and cool to the touch. "Some days you just need to hold something steady," she'd said as they sat beside the fire that night, the stone turning slowly in her hand like a worry melted into silence. Tom smiled now, remembering that moment, not with sharpness, but with the soft gravity of something that still held weight, even if it no longer hurt. On impulse, he reached into the pocket. His fingers brushed fabric, then something else. Thin, folded. He drew it out carefully. A note, faintly yellowed, creased in half, tucked away, perhaps forgotten, perhaps not. He unfolded it slowly. It was written in her handwriting, not cursive, but that neat, slightly slanted print she used when she didn't want to rush. It read, "If you find this on a cool evening, please make tea, sit near the fire, and remember the day we followed deer tracks all the way to the tree line and never said a word until sundown." That was all. No date, no signature, just that quiet memory, written like a blessing left behind for the exact right moment to arrive. Tom folded the note again, and this time he did take the coat off its hanger. It was heavier than he remembered, or maybe he had simply forgotten the way wool could carry both time and warmth. He brought it with him to the main room. The fire hadn't been lit yet. The logs sat stacked and waiting. The candle on the windowsill was already burning, casting its slow glow against the glass as dusk folded itself around the cabin. Tom placed the coat over the arm of the old chair. Then he moved toward the stove, kneeling slowly to strike a match, to place the flame at the base of the kindling, to coax the first pops and crackles into the room with the patience of a man who had never needed speed to feel purpose. The fire caught, the warmth began to rise, and the light deepened. He returned to the chair, sinking into it with a familiar sigh. The coat rested beside him like an old friend returned from a long journey, not speaking, just sitting. Tom closed his eyes, and for a long time he listened, not for words, not for ghosts, just for the sound of the fire and the softness of wool and the quiet knowing that some things remain simply because they were loved long and well. That night, long after the fire had settled into a slow rhythm of embers and sighs, Tom remained in his chair. The room around him had faded into softness, the kind of softness only firelight and old wood could make. No sharp corners, no harsh lines, only the curve of shadows dancing on the walls and the gentle hush of a house that remembered how to rest. The coat still lay folded across the arm of the chair. He hadn't moved it. He liked how it looked there, like a memory that had found its rightful place and didn't need to be put away again. The windows had begun to silver. He noticed it first in the way the light changed on the floorboards, how the lines from the frame became clearer, etched gently by something cooler than the candle glow. He leaned forward slightly and turned the wick down, letting the candle dim until only a small flame remained. Not gone, just content. Then, as if pulled by an old and quiet instinct, he stood. The air in the room shifted as he moved, not because of his steps, but because the space itself responded, like it knew he was going somewhere and gave him passage without question. He walked to the back door, passing the kitchen where a single plate sat drying and the kettle rested on the stove like an old dog in sleep. He opened the door slowly, and the world outside greeted him with the soundless hush that only a full moon can bring. The porch was bathed in silver. Everything touched by its light looked softer, gentler, as though the moon itself had laid a hand on every leaf, every railing, every pebble along the path and whispered, "Be still now, you're safe." Tom stepped out. The night was cool, but not sharp, just enough to raise the hairs on his arms, to remind his skin of the shape of the air. There was no wind, only stillness, and silence, but not empty silence. It was full of living things, roots breathing beneath the soil, moths fluttering near the roofline, and the far-off calls of night birds echoing like lullabies through the trees. He walked slowly down the steps, his hand grazing the worn wood of the banister, his feet familiar with every board, every squeak. The ground below was cool and soft beneath his slippers, the grass still holding dew even though the rain had not come. He moved toward the garden, not because it needed him. It had long since learned how to sleep without tending, but because that was where the moon was brightest. The rows of beans and tomatoes had grown unruly with the season. Leaves curled gently under the weight of night, and a few blossoms, stubborn in their late blooming, refused to close just yet. He stood at the edge of it all, his hands folded loosely in front of him, breathing in the quiet. From where he stood, he could see the outline of the fence, the old wheelbarrow turned on its side near the compost heap, and just beyond, the small patch of zinnia still standing, petals pale in the moonlight, like tiny lanterns dotting the dark. Ella had always said the garden never truly slept. It just dreams with its eyes open, she'd told him once, as they stood there together on a night not unlike this one. He closed his eyes for a moment, not to escape the view, but to let it settle deeper, to remember the weight of her hand on his elbow, the warmth of her breath in the crook of his arm, the way they would stand without speaking, letting the night do the talking. Sometimes in those moments, he had felt as though the world was folding in gently around them, not to trap, but to hold, as if even the trees knew that silence was more sacred when it was shared. He opened his eyes again. The moon had climbed higher, painting the tops of the sycamore with cold fire. Shadows reached longer across the field, and somewhere near the edge of the woods, a deer stepped silently through the underbrush, its ears turned toward the cabin, its breath clouding in the chilled air. Tom didn't move. He watched as the creature paused, looked toward him without fear, then turned and disappeared back into the arms of the forest. After a while, he walked back to the porch, each step a little slower, as if he wanted to leave part of himself out there among the sleeping leaves. He sat once more in the wicker chair, drawing the coat up onto his lap, letting it warm his legs as the night wrapped around him like a shawl. He would stay here a while longer, maybe until the candle inside guttered out, or until the sky shifted once again toward blue. But for now, he had everything he needed. A chair that remembered, a coat that still held the shape of love, and a garden that, in the hush of moonlight, dreamed beside him without asking for anything but time. The next day came quietly, as though it had tiptoed through the woods and slipped into the valley without waking anything. Tom stirred before the sun fully rose. The sky outside the window was the color of wet slate, with clouds stretched long and low like wool pulled slowly through calloused hands. Even before he sat up, he could hear it, the steady rhythm of rain, soft and certain, falling with the kind of patience that only old rain knows. It was the sort of morning that didn't call for chores, didn't press for attention. A day wrapped in gray, meant for staying inside. And so he did. He moved through the cabin with slow purpose, his feet warm inside the soft woolen socks Ella had once knit on a similarly damp morning. They were mismatched, of course, one ribbed, the other plain, but both carried the same comfort, a memory made wearable. The kettle was filled and heating. The smell of rain slipped in through the windowsill where the old frame didn't quite seal. It mingled with the scent of cedarwood and linen, forming something like a hymn only the house knew how to hum. Tom didn't reach for the radio. He didn't want music, not this morning. The rain had brought its own. By the time the tea was steeped, he had returned to the chair, the old one by the window, the one that held the shape of his days. Outside, The rain drew soft lines across the glass, each droplet tracing a path downward before merging with another, like small rivers finding each other on the side of a hill. It was not a storm, not the kind of rain that roared or argued with the roof. This was the kind that whispered, that stayed all day without asking to be noticed. Tom wrapped the shawl over his lap and took a slow sip of tea. He didn't need to do anything. He didn't want to. The world was already full. From where he sat, he could see the garden, its greens darker now, glossy with wetness. The marigolds bowed their heads respectfully, and even the bees had tucked themselves away, perhaps under broad leaves or in quiet knots of wood. The zinnias, though, still stood, bent but upright, colorful even in the dim light, and the trees swayed ever so slightly, their leaves applauding in slow motion, as if acknowledging this guy's effort to bring everything into stillness. He thought then of the time they had built the porch roof. It had been one summer long ago, hot and dry, when the shingles began curling up like sunburnt pages. They hadn't much money then, but they had time. So they bought a bucket of tar, a few rows of cedar shakes, and spent 2 afternoons perched carefully beneath the sun, replacing each piece while passing back and forth a bottle of lemonade that had grown warm by noon. He remembered Ella's arms smudged with tar, her laugh when she dropped a nail through the slats, and the way she sat beside him when it was done, sweaty, barefoot, but proud. "Now the rain will have somewhere to sing," she'd said, and tapped twice on the new wood like striking a tuning fork. This morning, the rain did sing, not in melody, but in rhythm, a soft tapping on the roof above him, and a deeper, slower thud as drops landed on the porch beyond. He could tell the difference. He'd lived under that roof long enough to know its voice, its changes in tone, its hesitations, its agreements with the weather. He set the mug down and leaned his head back, watching the candlelight play gently along the ceiling beams. There were streaks in the wood now, marks of age and long seasons, but they held, just like everything else in this house. The floor beneath the chair sighed softly as he shifted, the kind of sigh that wasn't tiredness, but release, permission. And there, in the low hum of the day, in the space between raindrops, a memory returned. It was of a particular morning not unlike this one, a rainy Tuesday. He couldn't remember the year, but he remembered the feeling. The hush in the house, the kettle singing softly, and the smell of biscuits baking in the oven with rosemary and a bit of sharp cheese. Ella had danced that morning. Not a real dance, but a silly sway as she moved between the kitchen and the stove, barefoot, humming that old tune she never remembered the name of. She'd spun once, caught his eye, and said, "If it's going to rain all day, we might as well let it." So they had. No plans, no errands, just bread and books and a board game with half the pieces missing but still playable if you made the rules up as you went. He had never forgotten that day, not because it was grand, but because it was full in the way small days are when you let them be. The kettle whistled again now, pulling him gently back into the present. He stood, stretching his back slowly, and walked to the stove to pour more tea. As he passed the window, he reached up and touched the glass with the tips of his fingers. Cool, alive, the rain still falling, and behind him the chair waited. The fire crackled low, and the day, wet and wide and whispering, unfolded gently like a soft wool blanket laid carefully across a sleeping lap. The rain had passed some time during the night. By morning, the trees stood dripping under a sky made of soft white wool, and every blade of grass wore a thread of silver. The garden was hushed, the dirt dark with moisture, the stones along the edge glistening like they'd been scrubbed by gentle hands. Tom woke slowly, not because he was tired, but because some mornings deserve to be entered like a chapel. Quietly, with a hand on the door and a pause before stepping in, he stretched once beneath the quilt, then sat up, listening to the house. It was the same as always, creaking lightly, holding its breath between wind gusts, waiting. He liked that about it, that it waited. He dressed slowly, choosing the softest flannel he owned, the one with a loose cuff and a missing button that Ella had refused to fix, saying, "Some things aren't broken, they're just well loved." By the time he reached the kitchen, the light had begun to change, no longer flat gray, but warming, deepening in tone as the clouds gave way to a pale stretch of morning sun. It fell across the sink in golden slants, catching the rim of the enamel basin and making it glow faintly, like an old song remembered in full. On the windowsill sat 3 apples. They weren't placed there for beauty. Tom had set them out the day before, to ripen, to breathe, to let the cool air deepen their color and pull up the sugars from their quiet cores. He picked one up now. It was small, with a blemish near the base and a skin that felt waxy with morning chill. He turned it gently in his hand, then set it back down beside its companions. They would wait. There was something in the air that hinted at baking, not in scent, but in the way the house felt, the way the light leaned toward the flour jar, the way the stove creaked slightly as if anticipating warmth. Tom didn't fight it. He pulled the apron from the back of the pantry door, tied it slowly, and opened the cupboard to gather what he needed. Flour, a bit of sugar, cinnamon if the tin still held enough. The bowl he used was the same one Ella had always preferred, a wide ceramic one with a faint crack near the rim that had never grown, despite their quiet agreement that it one day would. He sliced the apples with care, paring away only the necessary, leaving the rest intact. He didn't rush. He never did in the kitchen. Cooking, for him, had become less about the outcome and more about the being, the standing, the stirring, the remembering. As the oven warmed, he lined the pie dish, tucking the dough in at the edges like Ella used to do, pressing gently with the heel of his hand until it sat snug like a blanket over bare skin. The apples went in next, layered softly, dusted with spice. He thought briefly of adding raisins, but changed his mind. This pie didn't need them. It was already full of what mattered. He covered it with another sheet of dough, cut a few small vents into the top, and slid it into the oven with a motion so familiar it didn't feel like a task at all. Then he sat, not to wait, but to be. The scent rose slowly, filling the cabin like memory might, unhurried, welcomed, gentle. Outside, the clouds began to part in earnest, and sunlight pooled across the table. It touched the teacup waiting near the edge. It warmed the edge of the quilt tossed over the rocker. It landed, finally, on the apples that remained on the windowsill. Tom watched the light. He didn't move toward it. He didn't need to. It would come to him. While the pie baked, he opened the drawer near the stove. Inside were old spoons, a recipe card with Ella's handwriting, and a folded scrap of paper he hadn't seen in some time. He opened it slowly. It was a note, just a few lines, written in pencil. "Don't forget to serve it warm, and leave the window open if it smells like rain again." He smiled, folded the note, tucked it back where it belonged, and just then, as if in response, the breeze shifted, the trees outside rustled softly, and somewhere a bird called twice. The timer rang, low and distant. He stood, moved to the oven and opened the door. The pie was golden, not perfect, but golden. He placed it on the counter, watched the steam rise as if the apples themselves were exhaling. Then he did what Ella had always done. He cracked the window just a bit, enough for the scent to slip out, to find its way into the trees, to reach whatever needed remembering. And then he sat again, tea beside him, pie cooling slowly, and the light, that soft, steady light, warming everything it touched. The pie had cooled, the light had shifted in the house as always, had grown quieter in the hours just past midday. When the breeze settled, the birds tucked into the hedgerows, and the world seemed to fold itself in slightly, like a page turned softly, without need for punctuation. Tom sat by the window, not the front window, the one with the view of the fields, but the smaller one in the back room, where the old oak stood like a watchful uncle, and the bench beneath it had grown moss between the slats. It was here he came when the weather was too warm for a fire, but too soft for the kind of tasks that made you sweat. Here, where the afternoon felt longer, as if time stretched just enough for thoughts to breathe. On the table beside him was a worn notebook. The cover had once been blue, but now was the color of riverstone, creased and softened at the edges from years of being opened, closed, carried, forgotten, found again. It was Ella's, one of several really. She'd kept them not as journals, but as something more casual. A place for thoughts that didn't belong anywhere else. Recipes, poems copied from library books, lists of things she meant to plant next spring, even when spring had already come and gone. Tom picked it up now, his hands familiar with its weight, his thumb brushing the spine like greeting an old friend who still remembered your name. He opened to a page somewhere in the middle, not to any particular place, just where the notebook decided to fall open. August 14th, breezy, tomatoes nearly ready. Below that, in slightly smaller script, today I remembered the sound of grandmother's canning jars clicking in the cellar. I don't know why, but it made me want to hum something slow. Maybe memory has its own music. Tom read the words slowly, then closed the book just for a moment, resting it on his lap. He didn't need to rush. There was something about reading her words in her hand, in her tone, not lofty, not rehearsed, that made them feel more like conversation than writing. He opened the book again, this time near the back. A folded scrap of paper fell out and landed on the floor. He bent to pick it up. It was a list, nothing fancy. Tarragon, new dish towels, tea with Ruth, Tuesday. He smiled. It was like stumbling into an ordinary afternoon that hadn't expected company, but welcomed you anyway. He tucked the list back inside and flipped forward. One entry stood out, written in pencil, the lines a little lighter. There are days when I feel I'll never finish all I meant to do, and then I remember that wasn't the point. Tom rested his hand over the page, held it there, not as if trying to preserve the ink, but as if the words could still feel his presence. And maybe they could. The sun had begun to slant lower now, casting long rectangles of amber light across the floorboards. Outside, the leaves moved again, softly, as if agreeing with something unseen. He set the notebook gently on the table and stood, not out of restlessness, but because his legs asked for motion and the moment had offered it. He walked to the cabinet where he kept his own stack of unused notebooks, tucked neatly between a cigar box full of paper clips and a tin that still held, improbably, a few wrapped peppermints. He chose one, plain cover, no lines, the kind he used when the words didn't yet know their form. Back at the table, he opened the first page, uncapped the pen, and waited, not for inspiration, just for the air to settle. And then he wrote in slow, steady script, "This afternoon I remember the sound of her teacup on the saucer. Not the pouring, not the stirring, but that moment when she set it down just so, and the porcelain touched wood like a promise." He paused, let the ink dry, let the memory bloom a little more fully, then continued, "I think love is in the small echoes, the gentle ones, the ones you don't notice until the house is quiet enough to carry them." He stopped there, not because there was nothing more to say, but because the page had offered him enough for now. He capped the pen, closed the notebook, then stood, poured the last of the tea into his cup, and stepped out to the porch where the sun had just touched the horizon, and the garden had begun to glow in the light that comes only once each day, and always feels a little like grace.
City type. Friendly enough, though obviously out of place. He inquired about Canon Lorimer's personal effects. He said he was researching obscure ecclesiastical figures for a documentary. But I was struck by the fact that he had never asked for books. He only wanted papers, manuscripts. I told him the parish archives were kept at the vicarage, and he said he had already spoken to Reverend Trevis. Miss Marple frowned slightly. "Did you hear his name?" Dora bit her lip. "It was Walsh. Not Horace, though. Something else. Charles, I think. And there you have it. The seed. A second Walsh. A younger one." Miss Marple gave Dora a soothing smile and gently walked her to the door, reassuring her that she had done the right thing. As soon as she was alone, she picked up her shawl and headed towards the station. Inspector Crail received the information without surprise. He seemed to have had a similar idea. "We found a receipt," he said, pulling a piece of paper from his desk drawer. "A train ticket to Paddington, purchased 6 weeks ago in the name of Charles Horace Walsh. We tracked him down, a young man in his 30s working in London. He worked in legal publishing, but was previously a partner in a small non-fiction publishing house." "So it wasn't Horace Walsh alone," said Miss Marple in a soft voice. "It was his son." Crail nodded. "We believe he found the vicarage records through public records, perhaps through probate research conducted after Lorimer's death. He then contacted his father." Miss Marple sat back, her heart heavy. The son reopened the wound. Not out of grief, but out of curiosity. Perhaps more than that. We believe he encouraged Horace to return, perhaps even organized the logistics, documents, accommodation, travel. It is unclear whether he fully understood his father's intentions. But he knew enough to disappear once the vicar was dead. "We made contact," Crail said. "He agreed to come voluntarily, but it's unlikely he'll be charged unless there's proof he actively conspired. Yet, I think he knew, and I think he didn't care." Miss Marple was silent for a long time. Then she said in a low voice, "There is something far more frightening about indifference than about anger." She left the station, a strange heaviness tightening her ribs. The story had begun in sadness and ended in silence. But this silence wasn't peaceful. It was measured, calculated. She imagined a son delving into his father's past, not to heal it, but to exploit it, to shape it, to make something of it. Perhaps for art, perhaps for ambition. And in doing so, he had released something too old and too bitter to be contained. She returned home at nightfall and lit the lamps. Her little cottage was warm, lightly scented with lavender wax and wood smoke. She poured herself a cup of tea and sat in her favorite armchair, letting the silence settle in. The son had remained unmoved by the tragedy.
He reached for the small woolen blanket folded over the arm of the chair. the one Ella used to drape across her knees when she read in this very spot. He laid it across his legs now, not out of chill, but out of something else. A kind of memory that asks not to be remembered, but to be held. The cabin was so quiet he could hear the slow tick of the old clock above the mantel. Each second a small, unassuming heartbeat of a place that had known many seasons and had never rushed through a single one. He thought then of the apples they had gathered one October, years ago, when the orchard in town had opened its gates to neighbors and offered baskets to anyone with time in 2 hands. They had taken their old truck, the green one with the door that never closed quite right, and driven out under a low blue sky, laughing at the way the dirt road jolted the thermos lid loose and spilled coffee across her lap. "It'll dry," she said, grinning as she reached for a napkin. And they had picked until the baskets were full and their arms were tired and their pockets held more leaves than coins. That night they'd baked apple crisps until the oven steamed and the windows fogged, and she had stood barefoot in the kitchen with cinnamon on her cheek, telling him she thought this was the best kind of wealth. Tom smiled now, looking out at the frost-covered field, and thought she was right. This, the quiet, the cup of tea, the fire's soft crackle, the faint smell of wool and ash in memory. This was the good kind of wealth, not loud, not counted, but enough, more than enough. He didn't move for a long while. The blanket stayed tucked around his knees. The fire kept breathing, and the frost outside slowly gave itself back to the earth. When he finally rose, it was only to place the empty cup in the sink and tend to the fire once more. Not because the cold demanded it, but because it felt right to keep the warmth going. For the chair, for the room, and for whatever part of her might still be listening through the silence.
Then she smiled, weakly, slowly, and confidently. "Thank you, Mr. Giles. You have been a great help to me." When she left the office, the first drops of rain were falling. She continued home on foot, umbrella down, her mind racing, because now she understood. Philip had not simply covered up Harriet's crime. He had written this will entirely alone. There had never been a legitimate document signed by the Colonel, leaving everything to Harriet. What Harriet believed to be her uncle's will had been fabricated by Philip. Perhaps she had been suspicious, perhaps not. But if she discovered the truth, it would mean she would have no rights, no inheritance, only motive. So she silenced the Colonel. And Philip let her do it, let her incriminate herself. But Elspeth saw it. She saw the inconsistency, the false witness names, the change of ink, perhaps even the envelope, which hadn't been marked by the Colonel's hand at all, and she started writing everything down. When she returned home, Miss Marple no longer felt disturbed by the final play. She simply felt prepared. She drafted a final note to Inspector Lennox and enclosed a copy of the envelope. His handwriting, she had already deduced, matched neither the Colonel's nor the lawyer's. It matched Philip's. He had begun the plot with pen and paper long before the first drop of poison had been measured. Later that night, she stood by her garden window, gazing at the moonlit shrubs. The world wasn't perfect, but the truth, once discovered, had a strange way of settling in. Justice, she believed, did not always make itself heard. Sometimes it came in the folds of a forgotten piece of paper, or in the knowing look of a woman who had seen too much and spoken too little. The chair, which had once seemed always warm, was now in storage, sold with the contents of the house to a local antiques dealer who believed, rightly or wrongly, that it had belonged to a retired general. Its legacy would disappear into another living room, another life, but the truth she had helped to uncover would not fade away. Miss Marple closed the curtains, turned off the lamp, and went to her bed. There would be other mysteries over time, but for the moment, Peace had returned to Saint, Seds on water, and peace, she had learned, should never be taken lightly. The morning mist curled gently over St. Seds on water, softening the contours of chimneys and hedges as if the village were breathing gently after holding it for far too long. Miss Marple sat at her window, a warm cup of tea in her hands, watching the fog clear and thinking of the strange calm that comes when the truth is finally known. Not loudly nor triumphantly, but like a quiet certainty that settles deep within a place. The final letter had arrived that morning, hand-delivered by Inspector Lennox himself. It confirmed what she already knew, but even so, she had read every word twice, then folded it carefully and...
"You is the only quiet I need." He read it twice, then once more, and folded it back with the kind of care you give to something still alive. The tea had cooled in the cup. He didn't mind. There was something comforting in the way it tasted now. Milder, less eager, like it had waited for him to be ready. He took another letter, this one in his own handwriting. It wasn't dated. "The wind has come early this year. The garden is tired. You're resting in the bedroom. I didn't wake you. Somehow it felt like the world needed to be quiet a little longer." He didn't remember writing it, but he knew exactly when he had. There had been a stillness in the house that day, the kind that made you walk slower, touch things more gently, speak only if necessary, and Ella had slept through the morning. Tom leaned back in the chair. The box sat open on the table, letters gently breathing the scent of old paper and lavender. He didn't feel the need to read them all. It wasn't the words, really, that mattered most. It was the presence of them, the knowing that they had once been written in quiet moments on rainy afternoons, in spring sun or autumn dusk. Your love, he thought, was not always a thing of grand declarations. Sometimes it was a folded note in a tea box. Sometimes it was a sentence that never expected to be reread. Sometimes it was simply sitting down in the same chair at the same table and opening the lid again. Outside, the fog had begun to lift. The trees reappeared one by one, like old friends stepping back into the clearing. And inside, the kettle hummed again. The letters rested in Tom, with his cardigan warm against his shoulders and his hands folded quietly on the table. Closed his eyes just long enough to hear her voice in the room. Not loudly, just enough. The morning had settled into itself by the time Tom stepped outside. The fog had long since lifted and the sun, though low and quiet, had begun to warm the porch railing just enough to make the wood feel alive again. He carried his mug with both hands, not because it was full, but because the warmth of it felt good against the coolness that lingered like the tail end of a hymn. There was no wind, but the air still moved. It stirred the dried grasses at the edge of the garden, nudged the wind chimes softly, and turned a single leaf loose from the maple above the shed, which spun in a slow spiral before landing gently on the path. Tom watched it fall. Then, without quite meaning to, he stepped down from the porch and walked toward the shed. The shed was older than the cabin. It had stood through storms, bears, blizzards, and the weight of 1,000 heavy silences. Its roof sagged slightly on the left side, where an old limb had once fallen during an ice storm, but it still held. It always held. The door groaned a little as he opened it, not out of protest, just from age. Inside, the light was soft, filtered through the high, dusty window where cobwebs caught sunbeams like fishermen catching gold. He didn't come here often anymore, but sometimes the day led you without needing to explain where or why. There was a shelf along the back wall, lined with empty jars, old pruning shears, a small clay pot that once held mint and now held nothing at all. And beside it, on the low bench beneath the window, sat the basket. He hadn't seen it in a while. Woven reed, oval-shaped, with a handle that had frayed on one side from the years Ella carried it out to the porch on winter afternoons. It had once been filled with yarn, soft wool and faded greens and rust reds, gentle blues, and the occasional strand of cream that reminded him of morning milk. Tom knelt carefully and pulled the basket toward him. Inside were still a few skeins tucked under folded pieces of fabric, some cut into neat squares, some loosely rolled like forgotten intentions. He reached for one of the skeins. It was a deep gray blue, cool to the touch, but not cold. It felt like sky in November. He held it for a while, letting memory unfold not all at once, but in soft loops. There had been a winter, years ago, when snow came early and stayed long. The garden had gone quiet before its time. The firewood had to be split before breakfast, and the road to town disappeared beneath so much white that even the mail didn't arrive for 2 weeks. It was during that stretch that Ella began teaching him to knit. He hadn't asked, but one afternoon, as they sat near the stove with hands curled around mugs of broth, she had simply said, "If your fingers are going to be still, they might as well make something." And so they did. He had fumbled at first, the needles awkward in his hands, the tension all wrong. But she was patient, showing him again how to loop, how to pull, how to let the yarn do most of the work. They had sat for hours that week, not always speaking, sometimes just listening to the fire, to the sound of the snow falling from the roof, to the creak of the chair when one of them shifted. He never did finish that first scarf, but she wore it anyway. "Doesn't matter if it's crooked," she'd said, winding it once around her neck. "It was made by warm hands. That's what counts." Tom placed the skein back in the basket and sat down on the low stool beside the window. The dust in the air glowed. The silence of the shed was the kind that came from having been trusted with too many secrets to ever be anything but kind. He stayed there for a long while, his knees bent, his hands resting lightly in his lap, the basket beside him like an old dog come to sit at his feet. There was no need to knit today. The yarn didn't ask for it. It just needed to be remembered, and that, he thought, was enough. Sometimes things outlive their purpose but not their meaning. Outside, the sun had climbed a little higher. The frost on the grass had melted, leaving behind a shimmer like dew but quieter. Tom stood slowly, careful with his knees, and carried the basket back to the porch. He placed it gently on the bench, the one she had always sat on when her fingers were working and her thoughts had wandered into silence. He sat beside it for a moment, watching the light shift across the boards, then reached in, pulled out a soft square of wool, and folded it once more, not to use, just to touch, to remind himself that some things can still be held, even after they've let go. By the time the middle of autumn had settled in, the cabin seemed to have adjusted itself, not just to the cooler air, but to the different pace of the season. There was less light in the mornings now, and when it came slowly, as though the day was reluctant to wake the world too soon. The trees along the edge of the field had thinned, their leaves now lying in drifts along the fence line, tucked against the earth, as if they had finally decided to rest where they belonged. Tom had noticed that the wind sounded different these days. It no longer carried the quick rustle of summer leaves, that busy, restless kind of movement. Now it moved with a lower voice, a more deliberate sweep, as if it had taken the time to learn patience. He had begun taking longer walks around the property, not to cover distance. He never measured the path by how far it went, but simply to feel the ground under his boots and to see what small changes had come since yesterday. A new scatter of acorns near the oak by the gate, the faint tracks of a rabbit crossing the soft earth just beyond the garden, a single late-blooming marigold, its bright orange almost startling against the muted browns and golds of the season. Sometimes he would pause by the split-rail fence, leaning his arms across the top rail, looking out over the low hill that caught the last light of the day. It was never the same hill twice, not because the land had changed, but because his eyes had. In the afternoons, he often found himself in the old chair by the window, the one that had been there for so many years. It felt less like a piece of furniture and more like a part of the house's bones. From that seat, he could see the western sky through the bare branches, the light shifting across the hours. Sometimes a pale wash of silver, sometimes a deep, quiet gold. The chair creaked when he leaned back, but it was the kind of sound that belonged, like the settling of old wood in a well-built house. It spoke of years and the steady way time had passed here. He would bring a book to the chair sometimes, though he rarely read more than a page or two. The rest of the time he let his eyes wander to the world outside, a world that seemed perfectly content to carry on without hurry. It reminded him of Ella. She had known how to fill a day without rushing through it, how to do one thing at a time, and to give each thing the attention it deserved. He could still see her sitting at the kitchen table, mending a seam or peeling apples, the window open just enough to let in the smell of rain on the garden. He realized, not for the first time, that much of what she had taught him was never spoken. It was simply shown in the way she moved through her life. One evening, as the sun was lowering behind the trees, Tom lit the small lamp beside the chair. Its glow was gentle, barely reaching the far corners of the room, but enough to make the space feel smaller, more contained, like a warm pocket inside the coolness of night. He thought about the porch light outside, already glowing against the gathering dark. It had become a habit to turn it on before sunset, not because anyone was expected, but because there was a comfort in its presence. A small, steady beacon that made the whole place feel more like home. As the air cooled, he reached for the blanket folded on the arm of the chair and pulled it across his lap. It was an old quilt, faded in places, but still holding the warmth of all the winters it had seen. The stitches were slightly uneven. Ella had sewn it during a year when her hands had been busy with too many other things. But he liked it that way. It carried her in every thread. He closed his eyes for a moment, listening to the faint sound of the wind against the eaves and the even fainter sound of a creak somewhere beyond the trees. The world outside was moving, but only just enough to remind him it was still there. After a while, he stood and walked to the door, opening it just enough to feel the crisp air on his face. The scent of wood smoke drifted from somewhere down the road, perhaps a neighbor starting their first fire of the season. It mingled with the earthy smell of fallen leaves and the faint sweetness of apples stored in the pantry. He stayed there for a long moment, watching the last of the light fade from the sky. It wasn't a spectacular sunset, no bright sweep of color, no dramatic shapes in the clouds, just a slow dimming, the kind that asks nothing from you except that you notice it. And he did. When the cold began to press in, he closed the door and returned to the chair. The lamp still glowed softly beside him. The quilt still held its warmth, and the house, this old, quiet house, breathed around him like something alive and kind. There was no hurry to leave this moment, no need to turn the page. It was enough to simply be here, to let the night come in its own time, and to trust that tomorrow would arrive just as gently. That afternoon arrived without any announcement, no rainfall, no brilliance of sun, no chorus of bird song, just the gentle hush of a day leaning inward, like someone pulling a light shawl over their shoulders and deciding to stay indoors a while longer. Tom stood at the sink, drying the last of the breakfast dishes with a faded cloth that had a small burn in the corner. He remembered the day Ella had scorched it, setting it too close to the stove as she reached for something on the shelf. She had laughed, folded the damaged edge in on itself, and said, "At least now it won't get mixed up with the others." From that day forward, it had become the dishcloth, not the best one, but the one that was hers, the one that had memory. Tom wiped each bowl, each fork, as if polishing a moment rather than a thing. There wasn't much to clean. He didn't use much anymore, but the act of standing there, hands moving through warm water and cotton, brought with it a rhythm that was older than any list of chores. The windows glowed faintly with the last light of day. Outside, the grass had lost its summer green. It now lay dulled but dignified, folded in against the chill like someone turning in for a nap under a woolen blanket. A single bird called in the distance, low, unhurried, the kind of sound that didn't ask to be answered. Tom set the last plate in the rack, folded the dishcloth slowly, and carried it to the drawer Ella had always kept for linens. He opened it gently, the motion like a memory reaching back, and laid the cloth inside, placing it atop the others like a final page in a well-worn journal. Then he paused, his hand resting on the drawer pull, his breath steady. Sometimes it wasn't what you did that mattered, it was how wholly you were there for it. He moved to the chair by the window, the old one with the cushion slightly sunken from years of use, the one that knew the shape of his shoulders and the way he shifted his weight when the evening grew long. The sun was fading now, casting soft gold over the floorboards, not bright, but kind, like a light that understood it didn't need to try too hard. Tom sat, his hands resting loosely on his knees, and watched the trees beyond the field sway gently in the hush that comes before dusk. Nothing was moving quickly, nothing was insisting. Everything was simply present. He thought then of something Ella had once written in the corner of a calendar, not on a birthday or an anniversary, just beside an empty square in late October. Some mornings are made only for sitting still, and this, he thought, was the same kind of afternoon, not meant for plans, not meant for fixing anything, only for being, with the dishcloth folded, the light fading, and the silence growing soft around him, like warm flannel against his skin. Outside, the breeze stirred slightly, turning the last leaves along the fence. They rustled like old paper, pages turning in a story that didn't need a plot, only presence. Tom stood and filled the kettle again, not because he needed more tea, but because the sound of it boiling had become, in recent years, as comforting as the drink itself. As the water warmed, he sat back down. The chair greeted him like it always did, not with ceremony, but with quiet welcome. When the kettle sang, he rose without hurry, poured the water over the herbs, and waited, watched the steam curl upward, catching the amber light from the window, disappearing into the ceiling beams like breath exhaled without worry of being seen. Then he returned to the chair, cradling the cup between his palms, letting it warm him from the hands inward. The sky beyond the trees was turning from gold to a soft gray lavender, the kind of color that didn't last long and never asked to be remembered, but always was. And in that light, with the tea in his hands, the dishcloth tucked quietly away, and the hush of the room settling deeper, Tom let the world be what it was. Not dramatic, not perfect, not grand, but enough, more than enough. Evening had come and settled across the hills like a folded quilt, draped gently over the shoulders of the land. There was no sunset to speak of, only the slow dimming of light that softened every edge of the trees, blurred the distant fence line, and filled the spaces between things with a kind of tender quiet that words never quite reached. Tom stood at the window with one hand on the sill. He hadn't turned on the light yet. There was something about dusk that asked for patience, a kind of reverence, as day became night, not with a flick of a switch, but with a bow. He looked out across the yard. The garden had gone still. Even the last of the bees had long since disappeared, and along the porch railing a thin mist had begun to settle, curling around the wood like breath made visible. He walked slowly to the front door, opened it, and stepped out onto the porch. The air was cool, but not sharp, the kind of cool that slipped under your sleeves without meaning harm. Just a reminder that the season was shifting again. He stood there for a while, his hands in the pockets of his cardigan, eyes resting on the path that led toward the woods. Nothing moved, and yet everything felt alive. He could hear a distant owl calling once, then again. He could make out the faint rustling of a possum in the underbrush, sniffing its way toward something forgotten. And above all of it, a silence so complete, so wide and slow it felt like the porch itself had exhaled and begun listening. After a long moment, Tom reached up and flipped the small brass switch beside the door frame. The porch light clicked on, a small warm glow, golden, steady, spilling just enough light to touch the steps, the swing, and a few feet of the path beyond. It wasn't much, but it had always been enough. He stepped back, watched the way the light pooled along the edge of the rocking chair, and remembered, not a specific day, but 100 of them, the times he and Ella had sat there together, mugs in hand, listening to summer storms or watching snow fall silently beyond the railing. The times she'd bring out a blanket, not for the cold, but for the comfort of it. She'd tuck it around both their legs and say, "We don't need to say much, just stay warm and close." And so they did, again and again, across years, across seasons, until words became something less necessary than presence. The porch light glowed on, unbothered by moths or dust. It had that soft quality only old bulbs seemed to carry, as though it had seen enough evenings to understand when to shine and when to let the darkness speak. Tom stepped back inside. He didn't close the door completely, just left it ajar, enough to let the light drift through the screen and mingle with the candle's glow on the kitchen counter. There was something about the way the two lights met, one electric, one flame, that felt like a conversation between then and now, between stillness and memory. He sat in the old chair again. The window beside him had gone dark, but it didn't feel empty. It felt like something was still out there. Maybe wind, maybe stars, maybe just the breath of the world resting. On the end table sat a photograph. He hadn't looked at it in days, but he knew exactly how it looked. Ella, in the garden, wearing that wide-brimmed straw hat, kneeling beside the beans, Her hand sunk into the earth like she was asking the ground a question only she could hear the answer to. He didn't pick up the photo, didn't need to. The image was stitched into the fabric of the house and into the rhythm of the porch light shining across the threshold like a gentle promise that nothing was really gone, only moved into another kind of nearness. The kettle sang quietly in the background. Tom rose, poured a second cup of tea, and brought it to the chair like a ritual he'd carried alone but never truly felt alone in. He sipped slowly, watching the steam rise and imagining how Ella would have cradled the same cup, with both hands, careful, quiet. They had lived their lives in the small things, never with declarations, just presence, warmth, a light left on, a blanket folded and placed at the end of the couch in case one of them woke early and needed a moment of comfort before the sun returned. Outside, the porch light held steady. It would burn for a few more hours before Tom flipped the switch again, and the night would resume its full hush. But for now, that gentle circle of golden glow held space in the dark, not to banish it, but to remind it that even in the quietest corners, there is light that remembers and remains. And inside the house, a man sat in a chair by a window, wrapped in memory, drinking tea and saying nothing, because nothing needed to be said, not when the light was still on. The days had grown shorter without asking permission. The sun no longer reached the kitchen table by mid-afternoon, and the light that filtered through the west window was dimmer, cooler, less gold, more pewter. But Tom didn't mind. There was a rhythm to the shortening of light, a grace in it, the way the earth leaned in just a little closer to the dark and asked for less. He had begun rising later, sitting longer and writing again. Not much, just a few lines each day, scribbled in the corner of a weathered notebook he kept on the edge of the kitchen counter, near the salt tin and the little stone Ella had once used as a paperweight. This morning, the kettle took its time coming to a boil, and so did Tom. He moved slowly through the motions, grinding beans for one last batch of coffee before the tin was empty for the season, opening the back door just wide enough to smell the morning air and listen for the creak just beyond the fence line. It had rained the day before, a slow, soaking kind of rain that didn't flood, didn't shout, just entered the ground with gratitude, and now the world outside looked rinsed, richer in color but softer too. The leaves had all but fallen. What remained were the bones of trees, the long fingers of branches reaching out into the thinning sky like questions that no longer needed answering. Tom sat at the table with a mug of coffee and opened the notebook. The last entry had been a few days ago, just a line or two. I think the porch light means more now, like a heartbeat left on. Today he wrote something smaller, not because he had less to say, but because the words came quietly, like footsteps in wool socks on a wood floor. He wrote, "The stillness doesn't ask me to speak, only to stay." Then he closed the book, set his pen beside it, and let the thought settle like silt in a slow river. He wandered the house as the day stretched forward, not aimlessly, just gently, from one room to another, tracing the curve of the door frame, pausing beside the window that looked out toward the orchard, running his thumb along the edge of the pie safe that still held a few jars of preserves from the year before last. Each item in the house seemed to hold a little warmth, a little memory, but not in a way that pulled, more like the way a candle offers light, softly, freely, without asking you to carry it. By late afternoon, Tom found himself in the small back room. the one Ella had used for sewing and sometimes for reading when the sun came in just right. It hadn't changed much. A few spools of thread still sat on the shelf, faded now, unwound at the edges. Her rocking chair remained by the window, with the cushion that had grown slightly lumpy but still remembered her shape. Tom sat there a while, not to sew, not even to read, just to be in that room with the old cotton curtain moving gently in the breeze and the sound of birds settling into the trees outside as the day began to close its eyes. On the desk by the window was a tin of note cards. Ella had used them for everything: grocery lists, recipes, notes to neighbors, and sometimes messages left for Tom when she'd gone into town early. He opened the tin and sifted through the cards slowly. Many were blank, some were written in her hand. One in particular caught his eye. The ink was faint but still legible. "If I'm not back before the rain, put the kettle on. Leave the porch light glowing. I'll find my way home." He read it twice, then once more, and he didn't cry. He didn't need to. Some words don't hurt. They hold. He placed the card back in the tin, closed the lid, and held it in both hands for a moment longer. Then he stood, walked back to the kitchen, and placed the tin on the shelf beside the old thermos and the jar of honey that had crystallized over the months. The house had begun to dim again, evening pressing softly against the windows like a friend who knows they are always welcome, but never enters too loudly. Tom reached for the switch beside the front door. The porch light came on, casting its quiet glow across the steps, the path, and the gathering dark. Later, he would sit once more in his chair, a blanket folded over his legs, a warm cup resting in his palm, the house breathing with the hush of winter nearby. And outside, in the cool stillness of night, the light would shine on, steady as always, as if saying to no one in particular, "I'm still here, and you're still welcome." The wind moved gently across the field that evening, barely brushing the tops of the bare trees, but enough to send a hush through the world, as if the land itself had drawn a blanket a little higher over its shoulders. Inside the cabin, all was quiet, the kind of quiet that doesn't ask to be noticed, it just surrounds, lays itself down around your feet and settles like an old cat at the edge of the firelight. Tom had lit a single candle on the small table beside the chair, not for reading, not even for the light, but because some evenings call for a soft flame, a steady living thing that flickers without needing to prove anything. The porch light still shone outside, casting its golden arc along the step and down the path, as though the house were leaning forward slightly, still waiting for someone to come home, even if no one was expected. Tom sat quietly in the chair, the old one by the window, the one with the cushion that had shaped itself to the years. He wore his cardigan, a thick blanket folded over his knees. In his hands was the notebook, the one he had written in that morning, and the morning before that, and many mornings before that. But he didn't write now, not because there were no words, but because the words no longer needed the page. They just floated, softly, comfortably, through the stillness of the room. Outside, the stars were beginning to appear, one by one, slowly, as though they too were uncertain whether to interrupt such a peaceful night. Tom leaned back in the chair, his head resting gently, his eyes half-lidded. The walls around him were touched with shadow, but not the kind of shadow that hides. These were familiar shadows, the kind that remembered birthdays and winter pies and rainy Tuesdays spent doing nothing at all. He let his gaze wander across the room. There was the shelf with Ella's tea jars, now mostly empty but still faintly fragrant. There was the rocking chair by the window in the sewing room, quiet as always, the tin of note cards, the apron still hanging by the pantry door. Everything had its place. Everything carried its silence like a blessing. Nothing rushed, nothing lingered too long. He thought, not of big things, but of Ella's hands, the way they moved when she folded towels, or tucked a pie crust's edge, or smoothed the collar of his coat before he stepped out into the wind. He remembered her handwriting, slightly tilted, always neat, especially when she labeled seed envelopes with the names of herbs she liked to grow near the kitchen window. He thought of the way she used to leave the kettle half full, just in case he wanted tea after she had gone to bed. These were the things that stayed, and not the years, not the plans, but the gestures, the light touches, the presence in absence. The cabin sighed once as the wind pressed gently against its walls. A familiar sound, a kind of agreement between house and season, between memory and time. Tom felt no need to speak, no need to move. He simply rested, body and breath and thought, together, in a place that had long since learned how to hold them all. Later, he would blow out the candle, fold the blanket, switch off the porch light, and let the stars take over. But not yet. For now, he stayed in the chair, watching the soft pulse of the flame, listening to the silence as it settled like dust in an empty hallway, gently without needing to be swept away. And as the darkness deepened and the night wrapped itself around the old cabin like a lullaby sung without words, Tom let go of everything except this one beautiful truth, that love, the quiet kind, never leaves. It just changes shape and stays. And so, in the quiet warmth of this night, we let the story settle, like candlelight flickering low, or the last breath of a breeze through the trees. There is no need to rush, no need to explain, only to be here, fully, softly, in the stillness that welcomes sleep. If your heart feels a little calmer now, if your mind is slowed just enough to rest, then this story has done what it came to do. Sleep well tonight. You've made it through another day. You are safe here, and you are not alone. Let your breath find its rhythm. Let your body grow heavy, and let the night hold you gently until morning finds you again. When you wake, if you remember this quiet, even just a little, carry it with you. And before you drift off completely, I'd love to know, what kind of story would you like to hear next? You can share your thoughts in the comments below, quietly, whenever you're ready. Until then, good night, and thank you for being here.